On the 15th of June 1904, a paddle-wheel steamboat set out on a pleasure cruise on New York City's East River.
The people along here could actually hear the music, hear the children, and it looked like such a joyous occasion.
Less than half an hour later, the General Slocum was a burned-out hulk, and more than 1,000 people were dead.
You have one of the worst possible choices, death by fire or death by drowning. These life preservers had the buoyancy of dirt, and people sank like stones.
It was New York's worst loss-of-life tragedy in the 20th century, and one that has somehow almost been forgotten. June 1904. New York City was booming. The largest public works project in American history had given its people the world's finest subway system. The city's population of 4 million exceeded every state in the Union, except Illinois, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. New York's mayor, George B. McClellan, had recently renamed Longacre Square at 42nd and Broadway Times Square to curry favor with the influential New York Times. Thousands of immigrants arrived daily by transatlantic steamers lured by the low one-way fares. 75% of New York City's population was made up of immigrants or children of immigrants. But on the 15th of June 1904, tragedy hit New York City's German community. A disastrous fire aboard the steamship General Slocum had plunged an entire neighborhood into mourning. For the next 2 weeks, hundreds of funerals clogged the streets of Lower Manhattan. More than 1,000 women and children had lost their lives. 100 years later, few remember the historical facts surrounding the disaster aboard the General Slocum.
I got into the General Slocum 20-some years ago when I found out that this excursion boat burned right in the East River, and it was such a horrendous number of people lost, the fatalities.
Probably few of you have ever heard of what was New York's really greatest disaster before September 11th, the Great Fire on the steamboat General Slocum on the East River. Part of the thing that made this a more forgettable tragedy, if you want to call it that, is that these were mostly nameless, faceless, working-class people, Germans, unlike the Titanic, which had many of the most famous Americans and very wealthy people on board. Little Germany in Lower Manhattan was a very small neighborhood, so it was a concentrated tragedy.
Throughout the 1800s, German immigrants flocked to the shores of New York City, their heads filled with dreams, their pockets empty. By 1840, the only cities with a higher German population than New York were Berlin and Vienna.
Life in Little Germany was like any other ethnic neighborhood. A vibrant, culturally rich place. Wherever you went, you heard German spoken. All the bookshops had German titles. The restaurants, the food, and the street signs were all in German. Everything was suffused with German culture. People worked very long hours, 6-7 days a week, to get ahead and to move out of that neighborhood eventually, if they could, to a better circumstance.
Strong religious belief was the backbone of Little Germany. In 1847, St. Mark's Evangelical Lutheran Church opened its doors to serve the religious needs of the German community. By 1880, its pastor was a Reverend George Haas. By then, many German immigrants had achieved financial success and moved uptown to Yorkville. By then, Little Germany had dwindled to half its original size.
Haas, he was the Lutheran minister there. He was the focal point of the whole church and the little society that existed there, that whole German enclave.
Every June, Reverend Haas hosted a Sunday school picnic, always a popular event. In 1904, it consisted of a cruise on the steamer the General Slocum, up the East River to Long Island. Named after a Civil War general, Henry Warner Slocum, this magnificent vessel was the pride of the Knickerbocker Steamboat Company.
Well, the General Slocum was first launched in 1891. So by 1904, it was still considered one of the more elegant of the many steamboats that plied the waters around New York. To get out of the crowded, dirty, dangerous neighborhood, but actually getting on board a steamboat, taking a glorious ride up the East River out to Long Island Sound, and then spending the whole day in fun and sun along the shore, was almost too much to be believed. The General Slocum was 264 feet in length, had 2 great paddle wheels, painted bright white, 3 large, almost completely open decks, so you could really get the sense of being outdoors, being out on the water.
Commanding the Slocum was Captain William Van Schaik. In 1903, Van Schaik was presented with an award for safely carrying 30 million passengers in his career. At 66 years old, he'd earned a respectable salary and was nearing retirement. Reverend Haas couldn't have felt more at ease, his congregation securely in the hands of Captain Van Schaik.
The captain was on the boat since it was built. The captain was licensed by the Steamboat Inspection Service. The engineer had a license. Pilots had licenses. After you left that group, then it just became itinerant laborers, and they just picked them up probably the cheapest as they could get them.
June 15th, 1904, spectacular day weather-wise. There were 1,331 people on board the General Slocum, perhaps some more, but that was the official number.
It counted 2 young children as 1 person, and it counted 3 babies and maybe 1 person, so they really didn't have a good figure. The majority of people aboard that boat, women and children. Men either owned their own business or they worked for somebody, and they could not get the time off.
Ominous premonitions had been haunting Mrs. Philip Straub all morning, but she refused to let them ruin the trip. She'd been looking forward to it for months. She forced a smile, waved, and looked anxiously towards shore. But as the crew prepared to raise the gangplank, Mrs. Straub grabbed her children and fled.
The great majority came from the St. Mark's Parish, but there were lots of other people from the neighborhood as well, people who were not Lutheran, who were not German, so you had Italian immigrants, Irish, Jewish immigrants as well, who came sometimes at the last moment.
Various merchants in the neighborhood would buy blocks of tickets and give them out to their customers and as a promotion.
At 108 years old, survivor Catherine Connolly could still vividly remember every detail about that day.
Oh, that was a terrible thing. We were going to a little open island park for the day, and milk and ice cream was free. We had to be at the in the morning. I was 11. I was never on the boat before.
Catherine Gallagher Connolly lived on the edge of Little Germany. Her family was Irish Catholic and didn't belong to St. Mark's.
Gallagher, obviously an Irish name. I said, well, how'd you get involved with the church, which was a Lutheran church? And she said, well, I got involved from the German grocery store lady.
The grocer thanked Catherine's mother for her patronage by giving her free tickets for the Slocum trip. Catherine was disappointed when she discovered her mother was only taking her younger brother and sister. Feeling sorry for her, the grocery woman offered another ticket.
My father didn't want us to go. He was furious at the grocery lady giving her the ticket. My mother said she was never on the boat and she was going to take the children. My father said there's too many people on those boats.
At East 3rd Street now, and this is the approximate area where the General Slocum loaded. This park replaced the area where the pier was. The General Slocum, it was all decked out in flags and banners and painted white, you know, their finery and the women with their dresses and hats. It was quite an event.
According to the day's program, the Slocum would leave the pier as George Mauer's 10-piece band played Unser Kaiser Friedrich by von Blon. The time was 9:40 a.m.
We're going under the Williamsburg Bridge now, the Willie B. It was here in 1904, probably just opened around that time. Many of these buildings were not there, but the river was much more crowded than it is right now, with different types of sand barges and things of that nature. I recall as a child going up to the same route, actually, on an excursion boat. The school was let out for the day, as the children were in the General Slocum.
The Slocum had been inspected in the spring of 1904, 5 weeks before the fire. Inspector Lundberg went through the ship with one of the mates and essentially performed by all accounts, a perfunctory inspection. Poked a few life preservers with his pencil, but never took any of them down, and essentially pronounced the boat fully safe, fully ready to operate for the 1904 season.
The night before the boat sailed, they brought down barrels of glasses, and they packed the glasses in hay. And they stored them in a little room close to the bow of the boat, where they also kept the oil for the lanterns. And instead of taking the barrels off the Slocum, they left them on there. That's where the fire started, in the hay.
On deck, Little Germany celebrated the launch of a perfect day. But in the hold, a ticking time bomb was about to explode. On the 15th of June 1904, the General Slocum set out on a Sunday school picnic excursion up New York City's East River. The passengers enjoyed the perfect weather, oblivious to the growing danger below.
Well, the fire's origin is still, and probably always will be, ultimately a mystery. But we do know that the fire started in what was called the lamp room, which was just a forward cabin below decks that was used for storage. Pretty much everything, from oily rags to cans of kerosene to lamps to bags of charcoal, all manner of stuff.
It was unusually crowded in the forward cabin, where barrels packed with hay contained drinking glasses for the commissary. At 6:30 a.m., Walter Payne had prepared for the Slocum's day trip to Long Island. As the porter, his first job was to put kerosene in the lanterns that would light the cabins above deck. Without realizing the danger, he'd created a combustible environment just waiting for a spark. Later, at 9:30 a.m., 6-month-old Adela Liebenau and her mother Anna were among the Lutheran congregation waiting excitedly on the General Slocum's upper deck promenade. Although too young to retain personal memories of that day, for the rest of her life she would be surrounded by reminders of the 15th of June.
It was just a Sunday school picnic. I've been very lucky all my life, and I think I was just lucky then. There was no reason why I should have survived any more than anybody else. My mother and father were members of the church, second-generation Americans, but maybe they considered that we were immigrants.
On the morning of the 17th Annual Lutheran Church picnic, Adela, her parents, 6-year-old sister Helen, 3-year-old sister Anna, aunts, uncles and cousins all headed down to the pier for the General Slocum's 9:45 departure.
I gathered that they were carrying things in the hold that should not have been there.
That spark in that forward storage room might have been never heard from again. Most sparks just simply self-extinguish. This one found a unique environment, a warm room, the hay on the ground, and enough oxygen to keep it going in what's called the emergent smoldering phase, like the tip of a match that's been blown out.
And don't forget, this Slocum had been around quite a few years, and this was a routine cruise for this Slocum. The people along here could actually hear the music, hear the children, and it looked like such a joyous occasion as the boat worked its way up the river.
At 9:53 a.m., passenger Charles Lang spotted a pub he frequented. At that moment, he thought he overheard someone say fire, although he couldn't see a fire.
It happened just above Hell's Gate, and that's one of the worst areas of that river, currents and so on.
The Slocum was approaching a stretch of the river called Hell Gate, named after the powerful currents and sharp hidden reefs.
One tide runs into Long Island Sound that comes down Hell Gate, and the other tide runs out from the Atlantic, so it's actually, you know, the same waters fighting one another. Nobody goes through the gate without a great deal of respect for the dangers.
At 9:58, the Slocum entered Hell Gate.
As far as we know, this is about where the first indication there might have been a fire aboard, but the captain would not have known it. You can see the white water here on the top, and the whirlpool's actually spinning around. There's always a constant 4 to 5 knot current running around here.
The Slocum continued through the S-curve and around Hallett's Point. Workers from a stone yard noticed smoke coming from the steamer, but the passengers didn't appear concerned.
I think Knickerbocker Steamship Company was going to give them free chowder or something like that. And so when they originally smelled smoke, they thought there was the chowder burning over.
While the passengers misinterpreted the initial signs of danger, down below, in the belly of the ship, a lethal mixture of oil and hay needed only more oxygen to ignite. 12-year-old Frankie Paditsky saw smoke coming from the forward cabin hatch. Deckhand John Coakley told him to clear off and took matters into his own hands.
Anybody trained in fire safety knows you don't pull that door open. He had never been trained in fire safety, never experienced a fire drill, and so he grabbed the handle of that door and jerked it open. Suddenly the fire jumps from just a smoldering ember to an actual live fire.
At 10 o'clock, fire leapt into the engine room, sending the crew into a panic. Frankie Paditsky raced to the pilot house to alert Captain Van Schaik.
Do you remember the boy who started to yell about the fire?
A boy ran from downstairs, but nobody paid much attention.
They didn't believe him.
him.
There's a story about a young boy yelling up to the captain about a fire.
There's so much smoke. I think the boat's on fire.
And he told him to get out of here and stop annoying him. He thought he was just playing a silly joke. Really a weird mixture of people screaming about the fire and others not even aware there was a fire, music playing and everything else.
Coakley had been below deck for 3 minutes as the fire spread quickly.
This deckhand has no idea what to do. He tries to whap it out with a tarp. The tarp is tied down to the ground. He eventually drops a sack of coal on it, thinking that might smother it, and then he runs to go get help. By the time they show up to put out the fire, it's raging out of control because it's found really the ultimate thing for a fire, which is an unlimited source of oxygen.
A minute later, flames were seen for the first time on deck and panic erupted. It had been just 4 minutes since the first alarm, but already the inferno was rampaging upwards, trapping passengers, who would soon be faced with a terrifying choice: to brave the flames or the churning waters of Hell Gate. It had been less than 20 minutes since the General Slocum left the 3rd Street Pier in Lower Manhattan. Running for their lives were baby Adela Liebenau and her mother, Reverend Haas and his flock, and Catherine Gallagher.
Don't forget there was over 1,000 people on that boat. All the women were screaming and crying. The planes were coming up, but it was moving bad.
The evolution of a panic follows a fairly predictable path. In crowd situations, a couple of people immediately lose their self-control. That behavior is noticed by the great majority of the crowd. People essentially make the decision that if I don't begin to act more aggressively, then I'm not going to get a life preserver, or I'm not going to get into a boat. And quickly, that panic reached what psychologists call the point of demoralization. Good, Christian, nonviolent, decent people begin to pummel each other for life preservers, bite each other for positions along the railing of the boat. The only real effort to fight the fire by the crew on the General Slocum took place within the first 5 minutes. And they ran to the scene of the fire and began to do what they had never done before, which was to actually pull down these old fire hoses, hook them up to the standpipes, and get a stream of water going.
Turn the valve on! Let's go!
They might have pulled it off anyway, but the fire hose was 13 years old, had never been used, and never been tested, so when they hook the hose up to the standpipe and let the free flow of water go through it, the hose is kinked in places and it simply explodes. It's essentially at that point every man for himself. One of the many details that conspired to make it such an incredible catastrophe was the fact that the captain was not notified till at least 7, perhaps as many as 10 minutes into the fire. So while all mayhem is breaking out, while the fire is going from a simple fire into an uncontrollable inferno, the captain is simply piloting the ship up the East River.
Conklin, is there a problem down there in the engine room?
There's full of fire up in the bow, Captain!
Many of the options that he might have had in terms of pulling the ship to one of the nearby shores were lost in those crucial minutes. People began to rush about the boat looking for ways to save themselves, and many people on the upper deck found lifeboats that were secured to the deck.
My Aunt Annie said she tried to pull the life raft off the ceiling and she broke her fingernails trying to get it off. It was stuck fast.
Somewhere along the line of the 13 years of the General Slocum's operation, someone had determined these lifeboats were more nuisance than anything else, and they had wired them in place so that they wouldn't rattle around. Nobody could get them free. And people pulled out pocket knives. They tried to tear them loose. None of them budged. They were permanently affixed to the ship.
Even without the lifeboats, the passengers should have had another option. The Slocum was stocked with life jackets. But on that day, nothing went as it should.
Of the 2,500 life jackets on board the boat, almost all of them are rotten. They've been purchased back in 1891, never checked and never replaced. The internal portion of those life preservers was at one point solid cork. Over 13 years of exposure, that cork had been reduced to just simply fine dust. People pulled down the life preservers and they disintegrated in their hands. Some people actually put them on and then jumped over the side and found, once they hit the water, that these life preservers were actually, as somebody put it later, life killers. They had the buoyancy of dirt, almost like hanging sacks of flour around your neck, and people sank like stones.
The story is that they put the life preservers on the children, threw them overboard, and they sank.
I guess it was just a half-baked operation.
Full speed astern! Astoria! Astoria!
Full speed astern, Captain! Aye!
The captain, he knows that he's got to make some pretty quick and decisive decisions. He's just leaving the Hellgate, a very treacherous stretch of water in the northern part of the East River. On a map, it looks very simple. You either go to the port and pull over to the Bronx shore, or to starboard and pull over to the Queens shore. But he knows that this water is full of riptides and cross currents.
No, change that! Change that! Full speed ahead! North Rudder! Beach it, North Rudder!
North Rudder Island, Captain! Aye!
So he decides, knowing the river as well as he does, to head for North Brother Island, a minute, perhaps 2 minutes distant, just off the Bronx shore, where he might beach the ship and allow the people to jump off in shallow water and save themselves. Mariners are told to point the ship away from the wind, He decides it's too perilous to do so, and that it's worth, at great cost, to race for North Brother Island. As he charges forward, oxygen feeds the flames, pushes them back to the stern part of the ship, which is where most people are. And so it has that perverse effect of, as the closer they got to safety, the worse the fire got, the more the people were imperiled.
The strangest part, everything was close by. I mean, you weren't out in the ocean or anything, you were right close by both Manhattan and the islands.
The Slocum was 264 feet in length. The East River at this point, just 1,000 feet wide. With the fire growing in intensity, why didn't the captain just turn to the closest shore?
Why he didn't? My mother said that he probably didn't dock in a regular dock for fear of setting other boats on fire. My father felt that the captain should have docked the boat sometime sooner.
It's still debatable whether it was the right decision, but it was one that he stuck with. At one point he told the mate to pull into the Bronx shore, and then almost as quickly told him not to do so. And the ship rocked to the port side and dumped dozens of people overboard, and then rocked back when he ordered it to turn back to his objective of North Brother Island.
Today, jumping into the East River may not seem that threatening, but to most of the passengers on the Slocum that day, the waters of Hell Gate were a death sentence.
The immigrants did not swim, especially ladies.
Heavy shoes, thick clothing, dresses right down to people's ankles, men in full wool suits. Even a very able-bodied swimmer thrown into the East River that morning would have had a really difficult time staying afloat for very long.
When that deck collapsed, they all went down in the water, and that was it.
The idyllic church picnic had turned into Dante's Inferno. In a surrealistic mix of sunshine, smoke, and fire, the General Slocum's passengers had to choose between the roaring flames and the ripping currents of the East River. The 15th of June, 1904, 10:22 a.m. It had been a little more than half an hour since the General Slocum left the dock in Lower Manhattan. Now, it left a trail of bodies on a mad dash to North Brother Island, 5 minutes and a quarter of a mile ahead on the East River. Hundreds more would die during those 5 minutes.
I think that my mother was burned so badly on her left side is because she was hanging on to the railing of the boat. Probably had me in her right arm. Otherwise, I would assume that she'd be hanging on with both arms. She certainly saved my life, but the scars were always there, and they were terrible.
Even the people who knew how to swim faced great peril because all around them are panic-stricken people in the process of drowning. An able-bodied person might be able to stay afloat for about 90 seconds, maybe 2 minutes if they don't know how to swim, just from flailing in the water. And when you're in that manic phase of panic, if you see another human being, that person is as good as an island. Those who lived told stories of being grabbed from behind, having to pry themselves loose from people, and then not being able to save anybody because of fear of losing their own life and heading for shore. And so the East River is one of the busiest waterfronts in the world. Dozens and dozens of tugboats and lighters, barges, every imaginable boat is out there doing its daily business. When people see the Slocum race by, they drop what they're doing and head in its wake.
Soon, dozens of river craft were following the Slocum on its way to North Brother Island. A tugboat named the Wade was commandeered by 2 New York policemen, Tom Cooney and Tom Skelly. They braved the searing heat alongside the Slocum to rescue passengers from the burning decks. In all, 24 people were saved that day by the men on the Wade, including 11-year-old Catherine Gallagher, who nearly 100 years later remembered her rescue vividly.
I seen the fire and I ran. And this man grabbed a hold of me and took me over to the railing and hoisted me over, and that was the end of it. I just got off it and died.
There were a lot of heroic incidents there. People that risked their lives to save the lives of those involved. The best of human nature and the worst.
Oh yes, I gathered that the police were excellent, and a lot of the boats were. But of course then a lot of them were not, because it was that business of give me your jewelry if you want to be saved, you know, and that sort of thing.
Stories persist that some victims were approached by what they thought were rescue vessels, only to be looted and pushed back into the river.
We were almost to North Brother Island when the rail gave way and many people tumbled into the water.
I don't know
Hundreds
whether I dropped or whether I was pushed
fighting
off.
like mad to leap into
He
the
lost
water.
his hold of my hand. The last I saw of him, the look on his face was terrible.
I found myself struggling against the water.
Even then, the fire
And
was
it was
so
near
hot
me that my hands and face were scorched
The
and
most
blistered.
awful thing was the babies.
Around me were a score of bodies,
I looked back
most of
after
them
we'd left the
charred
burning
and
boat,
burned.
and I could see lots of them
It
lying in
seemed
the
to me
flames
that
near
I
the
sank
edge of the
hundreds
boat.
of feet and that I should never come to
they
the
were
surface
pulling each
again.
other down.
Then my strength failed me. I stopped struggling and didn't seem to care any longer whether I ever
And
rose to
pretty
the
soon
top.
they would lie still, and I knew they were dead.
As the Slocum approached North Brother Island, the crew gave up any hope of saving their ship.
Let's go! Abandon ship! Get out of here! Get out!
We lost! Beach it, North Brother! Beach it, North Brother!
His original decision to beach it up here on North Brother Island, if it had worked out, would have been fine, but he wanted to bring it right in, and what happened was the current took the stern of the boat, where most of the people were, out in the deeper water. And of course, the bow was covered with flames and everything, and then the fire was going back. This is the exact spot where the Slocum beached. We hear a lot with the World Trade disaster, ground zero. Well, this is the ground zero of the Slocum, right here on this beach.
Some of the more extraordinary stories of heroism come from the people on North Brother Island who were working their everyday jobs in this hospital that was for sufferers of contagious diseases. And this was a common thing in New York, to put these contagious disease hospitals on the islands near Manhattan.
Doctors, nurses, even patients came running out of the Riverside Quarantine Hospital to save as many as possible.
Now they, like a lot of the people on board the vessel, don't know how to swim. And so one of the nurses noticed that there were ladders up against the hospital where they had been doing some repair work. She lugged these 100-pound ladders, 35 feet each, into the water, and they then used those to extend out into the water to save as many people as they could.
And they said that at one time they were pulling bodies out about one a minute. They brought them up and they laid them out on the grass outside of the hospital.
10:30, half an hour after the first alarm had been heard on deck.
I saw old pictures and I wondered why there were so many barrels around. And then I found out it was the old way of resuscitating people. They'd put them over a barrel and try to do it that way.
People who started out as rescuers, pulling live babies, pulling children and adults to the shore or onto the boats, in about 10 or 15 minutes into this rescue operation, suddenly realized there's nobody left to save. Now they're recoverers, and their job is a far more grim and far greater task in terms of volume.
The bodies, they sink and then they come up again. They found them floating all the way down the river, and they also think some of them may have been carried out to sea.
Every time a boat came in with people on it, I ran over to look for my mother, but she was dead.
We lost 2 sisters, 2 cousins, and 2 aunts. My mother and I were saved on a boat. My father went with my uncle to look for the children. They found Anna, but they never found Helen. He was beside himself that he couldn't find the child. I don't know whether it was anger so much as just sheer grief.
What fascinated me as soon as the 9/11 happened, that the reactions were the same. grief apparently doesn't change, and the grief that I see in people today was the same horror in the days of the General Slocum. One historian, Professor Ken Jackson, Columbia University, figured that the difference in the population in 1904 in the country and the population today, that the Slocum was as much of a disaster in relationship to the population of the United States as the World Trade is to us today. A record was broken in 9/11, a record that I hope will never be broken again. 22 acres of abandonment, history and abandonment.
Today, North Brother Island is frozen in time, a stark reminder of the suffering witnessed on its shores in June 1904. Ghostly images of the dead and the heartbroken, trapped forever in the crumbling walls of the abandoned hospital buildings and the overgrown vegetation. But the General Slocum tragedy did not end there. The subsequent shockwaves would destroy more lives, causing the New York City neighborhood of Little Germany to disappear forever. On the 15th of June, 1904, women and children fought for their lives in plain sight of the New York City skyline. For 10 long minutes, the steamship General Slocum churned the waters near North Brother Island. A few found safe harbor, but for every survivor, 10 more perished, and some would never be found. Rescue now turned to reclamation. Diver Charles Everett was charged with retrieving bodies from the ruins of the Slocum at the bottom of the East River.
The wreck was complete, absolute. I crawled gingerly through the gloomy disemboweled section to amidships. I thought I had my nerves under control, but I only had a foretaste of the real extent of this calamity. There were at least 80 charred and pitiful, distorted bodies of women and children in the center of the vessel. They tell me I was down in the tomb about an hour and a half. That must be a mistake. I was down there a year.
Given the incredible number of people killed in the tragedy, the city officials realized they couldn't just simply send them to the city morgue because it was far too small. So they designate the pier right next to the morgue called the Charities Pier, big open space where they can put the maximum number of bodies on display and allow the maximum number of grieving relatives to get in there and make the positive identifications.
One of the most horrible scenes must have been at the temporary morgue, where people came in to identify the dead. They say there were suicides there. People jumped off the pier. They had nothing to live for, you know.
My father, he hadn't taken his clothes off for at least a week looking for the children. He found Anna, but he never found Helen. These are the shoes that my sister Anna wore the day of the Slocum, and they were found on her at the time her body was recovered.
When I got home that night, my brother and sister were in the casket already. My mother, she wasn't identified till the next day. I wore black for a whole year.
I know.
Black hair, ribbons, everything was black.
And this is the dress I wore when I was a year and a half old, dedicated the monument under which the unidentified dead are buried, and where I assume my sister is buried.
One of the more extraordinary days following the fire was, of course, the Black Saturday, June 18th, 1904, the day that the city of perpetual motion really came to a standstill, the day of the greatest number of funerals, as many as 200 funerals conducted on that one day alone. Thousands of people showed up in Little Germany. They lined the streets and just watched as procession after procession of hearses went by. White hearses and white horses for children, black hearses and black horses for adults. In the immediate aftermath of the fire, there was tremendous sympathy on the part of New Yorkers, just couldn't believe what had happened. But there was also this growing sense of outrage, because as more details came out about how incredibly unsafe that vessel was, the public outrage really rose to a fever pitch.
Greed by the company to make as much money out of it as possible. Greed by the people that sold the life jackets and knew about them. Greed by the people in the office that try to change invoices to show that the life jackets were up to date and just recently purchased.
A coroner's inquest was convened within weeks. Officers of the Knickerbocker Steamship Company, New York State inspectors, and Slocum crew members were questioned and proclaimed their innocence. Everyone had a plausible excuse. But for the handful of survivors who came to court, excuses would not bring them peace.
In the wake of the tragedy, all the boats were ordered re-inspected. They found hundreds and hundreds of violations, all the same kinds. Rotten hoses, rotten life jackets, inaccessible lifeboats, and an untrained crew.
They tried them a couple of times, and the only one that was indicted and found guilty was the captain of the boat, and he was sentenced to 10 years in Sing Sing.
A fairly harsh sentence, especially when you consider that nobody else was going to serve a day in jail. And the captain was, in many ways, a convenient scapegoat.
He put in 3.5 years of Sing Sing, and then they pardoned the president. He got a presidential pardon, and he died at 98 years of age in a Masonic home. So he had a long life, certainly longer than a lot of people in the Slocum.
The General Slocum disaster wiped out what was left of Little Germany. Today, the New York City neighborhood has all but forgotten its roots. Shop fronts and ethnicities have changed. But one landmark of Little Germany still remains: the St. Mark's Evangelical Lutheran Church. But now it's a synagogue. Nearby, in Tompkins Square, stands the only other reminder of the General Slocum, a lonely monument where every year a wreath is placed on the anniversary of the tragedy. Like memories of the Slocum and its fate, the inscription has faded. With each passing year, the tragedy grows more distant. Adela Liebenau Wotherspoon died on the 26th of January 2004, peacefully, at the age of 100. The other Slocum survivor, Catherine Gallagher Connolly, died at the age of 109 in October 2002. Her life spanned 3 centuries, leaving behind an astonishing legacy of 11 children, 26 grandchildren, 40 great-grandchildren, and 10 great-great-grandchildren. The General Slocum disaster was born of neglect, greed, and simple bad luck. In its aftermath, the Knickerbocker Steamship Company paid no penalty, but was forced to adopt stricter safety standards. Families of the victims received $500 insurance payment for every person who died on the Slocum. 8 years later, in 1912, the Titanic went down in the North Atlantic. Among the more than 1,500 who died were America's aristocracy, the wealthy and social elite, and it was this loss that eclipsed the General Slocum in America's collective memory. All those directly affected by the events of the 15th of June 1904 are now gone. While the disaster is a cautionary tale of greed and carelessness, it's also an inspirational story of courage in the face of unspeakable loss.